Hey, hello, it's me, Rob Ryan, and welcome back to a new episode of Entrepreneurial Thinkers. This week's show is all about community and content, storytelling, entrepreneurship, the journey, and Justin Gordon from Village Lane and newsletter and podcast fame Just Go Grind. Justin Gordon, my friend here in Los Angeles, his perspectives on all of those things, as well as the story on what he's working on, what he's building inside of and expanding inside of the media and content side of his business, Just Go Grind, and then also now inside of the vetted, curated community side of his business called Village Lane. It's a fascinating conversation that explores the importance of content creation, storytelling, tools like podcasts, newsletters, books, live events, vetted communities, meetups, all of those things, which everybody has on their mind nowadays. So if you're an investor who's trying to engage with your community better or trying to understand kind of where to meet and how to build relationships with founders in your local community, or you're an entrepreneur thinking about how to leverage community, true community, intentional community in the building and growing of your business, we explore all that, as well as dive into kind of the differences between audience and customers and community. And Justin brings his fresh perspective, his experimental nature to this conversation, and just his always positive, optimistic, upbeat, thoughtful energy, which I love, and I'm grateful to have as a friend and a colleague. So if you enjoy or are interested in any of those topics, we hope that you enjoy this episode as much as we did making it. Hola, hello, hi, bienvenido, and welcome back or welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers. This is the show where I get to have weekly conversations with the best and brightest entrepreneurial thinkers across all sectors and segments of society and industry today. As I hope we come together to use conversation to leave this world a little bit better than we found it. Today, I'm super excited, very grateful to be joined by my neighbor and good friend here in Los Angeles, Justin Gordon, the founder of Village Lane and the Just Go Grind family property of media properties, I should say. Justin is, in my opinion, kind of what I call an old soul in a young man's life. He is as natural a people person and community builder as I have met here in LA in recent years. And as I've gotten to know him, as I've watched him grow creatively from the venture investment side of the table to podcasts and his show, Just Go Grind, newsletters again at Just Go Grind, and now in building the Village Lane community, his vetted founder community and events business. Through all of these evolutionary steps, I've seen consistently that what makes him tick has remained kind of consistent and obvious. He loves to serve and support entrepreneurs. And in a startup and venture world where the word community is kind of often overused and diminished, in my humble opinion, he actually embodies the best of it. Whether at his local coffee meetups, at his beach walks, or at his weekend retreats that he's doing here in Los Angeles, and soon I'm sure he's going to tell us, taking over the world, spreading across the nation like wildfire. But from the time I met him, just in the early stages or latter stages of the early pandemic, depending on how you want to frame that pandemic period in our lives, I've always thought that he was kind of an indicator to me of what was to come. Kind of a venture world and a startup world that was going to be built more around content and community. One where cultural divides between kind of proverbial sides of the table are condensed and maybe even someday eliminated. Today, I really want him to help us explore how more modern, human-centered entrepreneurial thinking applied to this startup world that we both live in might just be the breakthrough change that every founder has been hoping for years. So with that, I say, if there was ever a guest that we could have done this in person, it would be you, because we live like 3 blocks from each other. But welcome to Entrepreneurial Thinkers, Justin.
Thanks so much, Rob. Yeah, we could have done it easily in person. Maybe it's a future iteration of the
Right?
show, but I'm excited to be here. Appreciate it, man.
100%. And it's funny because I have to admit, anybody that is a regular listener of the show knows I've never actually done a podcast in person, which is a whole other thing. Yeah.
They're fun. They're a lot of fun.
But ironically, you would have been the guy who could have tested that out on, but that's okay. So, hey, there's a lot of ground we're going to cover. I'm not going to make you individually responsible for defining community for the world. We're just sharing, everything is a disclaimer, right? We're just sharing your perspectives, your opinions, my thoughts, my opinions. But you do come to this with just an extensive amount of experience. And as I said in the intro, I believe just a really particularly important focus. Like I don't believe there are people that are in our space that are living inside of community or building businesses around community, that I respectfully to them kind of think they're doing it very opportunistically because it's kind of the hot, cool, du jour thing. And that's not you. Like, again, you were a venture side person who did podcasts when we met, and pull all the way through to where you're at today. And you're going to tell us all later about Village Lane, much more detail. But to me, you really are that embodiment of the right way to build community. So I'm grateful for your perspectives. And I guess the first question I would ask you is just the simple baseline. Like, what does the word community mean to you?
I mean, its simplest kind of core thing is bringing different groups of people together. For me, there is a through line throughout my entire career around that. You mentioned the kind of venture side of it, but if you go back to even when I was growing up, like our house back in Wisconsin, where I'm from, our house was a place where all different friend groups got together at one place, even if they didn't interact with each other. So I'm talking like growing up back in kindergarten, that was always the case. And that's always what I cared about. That's always what I was interested in, like bringing different groups together. Because I, as you mentioned in the kind of intro, can get along with pretty much everyone. And so that was like almost like the glue that brought everyone together. And so for me, community, even from like a very young age, has always been a part of it. I even have pictures of like me as a young kid, I think it was kindergarten actually, of like building a block tower with other people. We're building the largest block tower we can. I'm kind of leading the way with these kids around me. Obviously, we're all kids, but I was very tall growing up, so it makes me look like a giant. But it was that community piece, even when I was a very young person. It kind of still continues today. It's just different iterations of community in a way.
Yeah, that's fascinating. By the way, we've known each other for a few years, and I never knew that common shared reality. That was my house as well. Like that was my parents' whole approach to life. They said, like, let's make the one way we can either control or have an oversight on our kids' lives is by making our house the house that everybody comes to. Which then I repeated as a single dad parent raising my daughter here in Southern California, having no idea how to raise a kid, and let alone a teenage girl here in Southern California by the beach. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to make my house the house. I'm going to have oodles of food. I'm going to have the music. I'm going to have the video games. I'm going to have the garage set up so they can drop their surf swords off. Like whatever they need, I was going to make my house the place. And eventually, like you said, that does foster community. That's fascinating. You hinted, you talk about, like, you're from Wisconsin, I'm from Chicago. We have that in common. I would argue, I think most of the world in the U.S. who understands kind of regional cultures would argue that, you know, the Midwestern part of the U.S. where we grew up is kind of like the root of this idea of community, right? In American culture, right? It's just kind of baked into the DNA of that. But having worked in venture investment and kind of in the technology startup world now for some years, how do you see the word community either being utilized properly or overused, maybe, and abused kind of in the present day tech ecosystem?
I mean, everything's driven around kind of our motives and incentives, right? So you can see community from two different angles. If your incentive or like your motive is to kind of use that purely in like an economic term, that's fine. But like a lot of people are trying to do it generally to kind of improve, almost like a 1 + 1 = 3 situation, where others are more of like a 1 + 1 = like money in my pockets, which is a whole different thing. So for me, I see that in the industry, but it's very clear that it helps you stand out. And obviously, I was on the venture side of it before, and you can see very clearly people who invest in the community side of it, whether it's helping their founders, helping them get access to more deals in this kind of ecosystem we play in. It's core to everything. So when I was at Vitalize, that was a huge part of what we did. We launched an angel investing community to kind of bring other investors together at an earlier stage than we invested in from the fund. But then inherently, a lot of what I did at the firm was also just kind of greater community efforts to increase deal flow, like have people know about us, and then have people join the angel community. And it all kind of ties together as one. So you do see some firms committing a lot to that. So they'll have a head of community or like someone who's just running community, even Headline's a venture firm I scout for now. And like Michelle at Headline, she's running community. They hired her relatively recently, but she's just trying to do events, bring people together, different groups. That is like her core role. So you have a firm like that devoting a lot of resources to that and being consistent with it. And you see it across the ecosystem. The kind of divide, though, is what I see is that you have some firms who are only doing that in a very kind of private way. You almost don't even know that they are events going on. And I've only heard about them because I've been lucky to kind of being connected to a bunch of people where you're like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. But yeah, they're not public about it. It's only to like certain people. And you have other firms firms who are way more public about it like more of a headline for the most part. And that's like almost a divide in the industry where some are more elitist, you could say, and some are more open, but also doing a mixture of types of events and community. So it's just kind of all over the place in this industry. It just depends on the firm and what their motives are, essentially.
It's interesting. I heard something the other day, and immediately I heard it on a podcast. I thought of you, and I thought I would love to hear your take on this. So someone was saying essentially like, hey, guys, hey, everybody, sometimes you just have customers or users or people that buy your stuff from you. They're not all community members.
For sure.
Right? Like sometimes there are people who subscribe to something that they want to take intake from you, content, whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean they're community members. Like, you think that's true? Like, do you think, again, we overuse it? We've literally made everybody as a community. And sometimes there's nothing necessarily wrong with that firm that might say, hey, we're just doing this for our own little purposes. But then that's basically just then don't hold it out to the broader world that like we're big, huge community builders. No, what you're doing is you've built like we grew up with like private country club that I used to caddy at when I was a kid, right? Like that wasn't a community club. Like the golf club where the regular people went was down the street, right? But the golf club where just those people who paid money to be in that club, there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. But don't promote that. Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is like one-to-many is an audience. It's very clear. One-to-one is more of a community. If you're bringing people together to talk to each other, that is a community. Yeah. If you're one-to-many, it's just like a microphone, a megaphone, that is an audience, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with having an audience. But like how I view things is I always wanted to have like a massive audience that then educates and inspires, but then bring people together in the community fashion where they have these one-on-one conversations. So we can get into all the things I've done in the last like number of years, but that's very much so community driven is people meeting each other. So if you're just always like putting out content that's just for like, it's not bad to have this one-to-many thing, but if you can use that to then bring people together, that is the core community thing. It's not, it just gets thrown around like very lightly. But the distinction, it matters in like many ways, what you're building, but most people are building audiences. Most people are.
Exactly. I think the key thread underneath everything you just said, right? Intentionality, right? Just being intentional about what you're doing, no matter how you're doing it, and then communicate that fairly to your broader world, whether that be your audience or your community or whatever it is, right? So that's awesome. You just teased it. And so I want to dive in because at the point we met, right, you're on the venture side and we met online, very, very common thing to happen, around the pandemic era. But I knew you as, he's part of this team for this venture group, which was from the Midwest. And so that kind of caught my attention, but it was that you were doing these podcasts, right? And you were much further along in the journey than I was. I was much less mature in this journey. But it was like, that was your identifier. So to me, like why did you you did podcast interviews with startup folks, and then later you evolved that into like a newsletter format that provided these incredibly detailed, like in my brain, I don't know that I've ever said this to you publicly, I thought of like 60 minutes episodes level types of research on their stories and kind of a representation. Almost, honestly, you were almost like an author of these new biographies of these people. Which is a whole other discussion. But why storytelling? Like why at the earliest iteration, like your origin story when you're in the venture community, like why did you decide to start that first podcast?
Yeah, I mean, it all comes back to kind of almost like scratching your own itch as a starting point. So for me, in 2000, to give you more context. So in 2018, by that point in time, was at an e-commerce company. I knew I was going to get an MBA. I had already gotten into USC. And in January, I launched a blog that was more going to be a kind of career exploration type of blog. So I had people contributing to it. So I'd basically send over questions. They would submit them. That was like the blog. That was just Go Grind in January 2018 when I first launched. And then by June, it was like, well, I love having these conversations with people, asking follow-up questions. I want to go deeper than just I send over questions and like, well, what about this thing you mentioned and this thing you mentioned? So then it was the podcast that started in 2018 in June. Okay. And from that, it was a matter of like, I was exploring careers and scratching my own itch was like kind of a cheat code just to ask other people how they kind of went about it in their career, how they decided what to do, how they chose certain paths. And I was definitely entrepreneurial back then, but I wasn't just focused on founders. It was, if you look at the first episodes, probably don't listen because they're terrible. But the first episodes, the first episodes were like a mixture of people in different like careers. Someone working at like a
Yeah.
big corporation and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
But they were interesting to me because I was just exploring different paths. And as it
Right.
evolved, it was okay. Well, the people I enjoyed talking to the most were founders. I know eventually, like that's always what I wanted, just be running my own company. And so then it became very clear. And then from there, it was driven by okay, well, I want to help founders because that's clearly what I want to do in life. And then it was a matter of well, if I interview investors, they provide the perspective on the other side of the table, which will help founders.
Okay.
And so everything was always viewed from that lens of let's help founders, what's interesting for founders, and also like what I enjoy. And so then started interviewing more investors, and that kind of led to everything. So I did during the MBA program and just kind of did it for a while until we get into the pausing of it, but it paused in end of 2022, kind of early 2023. There's just a lot of reasons I can go into that, but like, yeah, I paused, but that was the start of it, was just like,
Yeah, but even the pause felt like, and we were friends by that point. Even the pause felt like kind of a exploratory purpose, right? Like it felt like you were like, okay, I gotta stop doing something.
Yeah.
In my lexicon of things I do, I got to stop doing something to free up the time and the energy. Really, frankly, not just time, like creative energy, to be able to have my brain think about things differently or think about other things.
Definitely. And yeah, more context around that time. It's like even pausing it in that point in time. Imagine it's like you're full-time at a venture firm trying to both grow the overall audience for the firm, help grow the angel investing community, do all these things that we were working on. And then it's like also trying to podcast, and I was trying to do a newsletter. So also trying to do a newsletter. And it's like, apparently, Rob, there's only 24 hours in a day. So I need to things out to make time for that. And I work a lot, but it's like, you're still limited by your capacity. And I've been mostly a solo operator with like help from assistants or so like the entire time. So yeah, I had to pause it.
All right. So I got one more question before we jump in and let you tell us all about Village Lane and everything kind of that you've been working on and are working on. But you and I talk a lot offline. We talk a lot about the content business. And now I think lately our conversations are like the content and community business, right? And there are all kinds of tactics and strategies. There's all kinds of how you can do it, how other people do it, how you can capitalize it that we talk about. But I would love to get your insights. This is like what we would be talking about if we were sitting having coffee right now, right? Like, what surprised you, if anything, over the last few years, kind of about the business of content and storytelling? And then the second part of that question would be like, as you look ahead, any number of years into the future, how much of a role do you think personal storytelling is going to play in the lives of growth for entrepreneurs and their businesses?
Yeah, I mean, to answer that last part kind of first, like storytelling has always been key and critical as humans, obviously. And then for businesses, you're seeing it more and more. I think her name is Lulu from she's like her own agency called Rostra, working with founders to help them go direct and tell their story. And that's going to continue, I think, just that founders going direct, leveraging their storytelling. That's always going to be a huge piece of it. And not just founders, like people in every industry. You're seeing so much pop up in terms of agencies to help people write, help them tell their stories. You're seeing even like on the book side of things, people using books to kind of leverage their story and tell their story. And then where there's kind of the industry, like the monetization, like the business kind of behind it is super interesting to me as well, always. Because I think our mutual friend, Ed, kind of got into my head about this whole idea of IP and thinking about your content in that way, which kind of evolved my thinking a bit from just kind of making content. So what's like the back library? And when I think about the business model, I'm like a student of the game, obviously. So I look at podcasts especially. So if I look at Acquired or Founders podcasts, and then people doing kind of these in-depth content that takes, so Acquired, for instance, a podcast that takes like 6 weeks per episode. They're doing in-depth research. Same with Founders podcast. He's reading a book each time. To me, that's super interesting as a model because it's really hard to copy that. And the IP is super strong. So there's an article about Acquired where they just did a 6,000 person show, a live show. So obviously leveraging an audience then to do in-person things as a community. But they did that. And in their last month of downloads, it was like 33% came from episodes older than 6 months. So I look at content and the business model of it as like thing that has IP and things that can last longer is super interesting and expanding beyond strictly advertising. So obviously you have advertising, which will always be around. But then when you have ones like, I'll just keep using those two as examples, Acquired doing a live show is super interesting. They had their kind of LP program, which is like more of a continuing membership thing. And then Founders did Insights, which is their whole kind of like pulling the strategies and tactics from all the research. So I think this kind of vertical almost like stack of things where you go from, if you're doing in-depth content, which is what I like and I prefer, how you repurpose that in different ways that you can have different business models from that. So both
Yeah.
from a community standpoint, but also from building products from it, expanding beyond advertising. Because if you look at most media companies, they have to expand. One of the ones I love is like The Information. They have amazing coverage of all things like startups and everything, but they do not only a great job of it, but they also are all like not sponsors for the most part. They're mostly a subscription media company, but then sponsors for different things like events and stuff also pop in from time to time. And they're doing lots of events side of things. So there's just so much to go through as far as business models.
Yeah.
It's just more a matter of like what fits your content, your niche, what you believe in. Are you going broad? Are you going narrow? There's a ton with like niche B2B media versus the Mr. Beast style going as broad as possible. It just
Right.
depends on like what business you want to be in essentially too.
No, it's fascinating to me. I mentioned was on one of our shows in a conversation maybe 3 weeks ago or so for an episode that's coming out, and I don't know how we got into it exactly. I don't remember now, but I thought at some point like everybody will have a podcast, right? Now, if you and I had said that to each other in 2020, it would have been like with the eye roll of like, yeah, everybody's trying to have a podcast, right? But I think that the perception then, and it's not that long ago, just a few years ago, was this idea that like, everyone's got a podcast, that same sentence, but it was as if to say like everybody's trying to be Joe Rogan, right? Everybody's trying to have like, 100 million listeners a month kind of thing. And now, quickly, to your points, I think what's happened, my humble opinion, I'd love your thoughts. Like, I feel like what's happened is like everybody's realized a lot of what you just said is becoming like true or becoming known, and then kind of becoming the truth. Like podcasting is just an incredible medium through which to capture whatever it is you're like. So if it's a solo show, like I now do this Friday shows, it's like my weekly roundup, like,
Yep.
Okay, cool, stoppage time. It's like something different. It's my take on the week. And yes, there's like throwbacks to the episodes on Entrepreneurial Thinkers like this. And, but then there's these kinds of shows. Then there's co-host shows like what this show was originally when we started years ago. And to me, I think literally like it just becomes a business tool. Like I'm curious, do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, generally, I think if you look at it from a Joe Rogan level, trying to be huge, it doesn't make sense for most people, right? So,
but that'd be like saying like like we're all going to try and become the Super Bowl broadcast of whatever we're doing, which is absurd.
Exactly, which is an absurd take. But for the most part, if you look at it from a few different angles, one being the relationship side that drives a lot of things is super interesting. I think getting access to people and having these conversations, you just don't typically get to do it in the same capacity, even with your friends or people. Like you don't have a one-sided conversation. It's like it's way different medium that you can leverage for relationship building. And imagine you're a founder, for instance, and you have 100 listeners, but your average customer value is like 20K a year, and you get 5 of them are listening, and you know what I mean? That's just insane, the value you can get from that. So there's gonna be more niches, there's gonna be different personalities. Also, your take on things. You could be covering the same topic, but it's your take on it that makes it interesting, makes it different, makes it unique. And leveraging that is super important. Back to the point of storytelling, it's like you're going to tell a story different than anyone else would tell a story. There's going to be parts that are similar, but you are definitely going to have your own take, your own view, because of your whole life is different than anyone else's life. And so I think that's only going to continue in terms of these kind of niches of media and content, and especially when you think about podcasting, because these conversations, like anyone can, doesn't mean everyone can make it great, but it doesn't mean everyone could do it, right?
So no, right. So I mean, we could apply the same thing to any other medium, newsletters, as you would have said in the past, blogs. Like, doesn't mean everybody's going to be excellent, like be an excellent writer or be an excellent communicator. But even nowadays, in today's world, right, you can either leverage technologies, you can utilize AI, or you could literally outsource parts of it and say, like, okay, I realize it's important for me to create content in this way, so I'm going to do that, but I'm not really good at it natural, so I'm going to do it with the help of these people.
Yeah, and I'm also a huge fan of like using media as a almost forcing function for your own learning. And so it is a massive cheat code that I study world-class founders essentially for a living, because anytime I'm talking to founders, anytime I'm thinking my own business, like I'm already reading and I've done 60 plus deep dives on world-class founders. I've done overall, not just my own podcast, I've done 400 plus interviews of founders and investors. I just learn a bunch. So it's like, I'm surprised sometimes when I bring certain things up that I remember from like 3 years ago conversation with someone. And like, if you can do that, where you leverage media to not only build relationships, but also learn. Like the compounding of that over time is massive. Even if the financial isn't immediate, like the back end of that is huge. So like I think there's just so much potential for everything with media. I'm obviously very bullish.
And to be fair to like this conversation, I mean, dude, you're like 20 some odd years younger than me. So you like talk about being ahead of the curve. I mean, that's like
five or six, right?
Right. When I was your age, we were excited to get a fax machine right in the office. So I mean, you're like, imagine you, and I'm excited. I'm imagining you at my age at 56, right? Having done all of these things, having leveraged these tools the way that you just described. And then I'm imagining that compounding effect if you just apply that to anybody, right? Anybody has that capacity nowadays because, again, the tools are cheaper, the tools are more helpful, the tools make everything more accessible. It's awesome. Yeah. Okay, incredible segue. And you can tell us your story. This is your chance to do your commercial about Village Lane, about Just Go Grind, and you can tell it in any order you want to. For us, as we talked about in the beginning in your intro, kind of you migrated from blog to podcasts to newsletters to like different kinds of newsletters, and now you've birthed in this last I think 6 months or so Village Lane, which you will tell us all about. We haven't talked about it yet. So you can tell us that evolutionary story, or you can start from today and just talk to us about what Village Lane is and why you're the CEO and founder of Village Lane.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just willing to experiment with almost anything. So
you may be my biggest experimenter as a friend.
Yeah, I think it's just the most fun to try different mediums. You don't really know, especially when you do have a long-term view of things. You're not really worried about things crashing and burning in the short term. I just don't care if something doesn't work in the short term because I have a belief and a confidence that, okay, what's the worst that could happen? Okay, go live with like my mom or dad or something. Like there's like the worst situation is very, very okay for me.
Right.
And so like most people have that, a friend they could stay with or whatever. Like you could try an experiment, you get a job, who cares? Like there's plenty you can do. So with that lens of things, I've always been willing to test. The podcast was a test. Just Go Grind started blog to podcast, and I've tested different like newsletter types over time. I did like a startup hiring newsletter. I did maybe 5 editions, but that obviously wasn't my passion. It was more an opportunistic thing I wanted to try out, like learn. Yeah. And I probably could have taken that to an interesting spot because you could just crowdsource stuff and build an interesting hiring newsletter. It would be very clear who you'd work with the sponsors, but I didn't want to do the idea. So I kind of drop it. So that's a common thing. If I don't want to do it, it doesn't matter. I don't really feel like continuing on. And then when it kind of switched from the podcast ended 2022, where I was like, I just want to get back into writing because context, even back in 2012, 2013, I started blogging in fitness. And that was how I got fitness clients back in the day. That was how I kind of grew my name in that industry, kind of sharing my learnings, and then had grown a blog to like 5,000 like monthly visitors pretty quickly. And like, that was the beginning. So then Just Go Grind evolved. It was like, okay, I'd done the podcast for a while. I'd grown to a certain point, but it wasn't, massive. But I was just like, I want to get into writing. I want to pause this podcast for a bit. And so then when I started kind of writing again this newsletter end of 2022, I mean, it started as just a whatever essay I wanted to write. Like I wrote some random things because I wanted to get it out there. I don't really care. I was willing to experiment. And only in 2023, in February, when I heard of Sam Altman on a My First Million podcast, and I was like, I know who he is, but I don't really know the backstory. My curiosity goes off, and I spent 2 weeks, like every morning, every evening, every weekend, just trying to learn about him and researching him to write a deep dive, because I had done that in the past in fitness. I would write celebrity workouts and write I'd chronicle from like multiple sources, their workouts, their routines, whatever. So I already had that like skill set in a different industry like a decade prior. So then fast forward to 2023 when I'm writing about Sam Altman, I do that one and great response. I enjoyed doing it. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. The next one was like Melanie Perkins. Okay, I want to do a different angle here. I wanted to alternate between men and women because I want kind of equal representation. I thought there's like it's kind of almost like undertold stories. And so I wanted to write about her and like kept kind of alternating. And then over time, by the time I get to May of 2023, it was, okay, this has grown to maybe 6,000 or 7,000 ish subscribers. The first 3,000 or 4,000 were organic. I had spent some money to grow it after that. And then it was a point in life where it's like, these take 20 to 30 hours to write. I also have a full-time job at Vitalize.
Right.
I had got my first sponsor, which was like maybe $1,500 for my first sponsor for the newsletter. And I was like, well, obviously there's some validation of I can get paid to write this thing. Basically, like I could try, had a little bit saved up. I was like, let's go for it. And then it progressed from there. It just kept growing. Today it's at like 22,000. I've like cleaned the list before, so maybe as high as 25,000. Cleaned some emails out, and then by the time I got to like early last year, I was trying to figure out the next step. Sorry, early this year, I should say. Was trying to figure out in 2024, like, okay, this year, what am I doing with this? Where am I taking this? I don't want to just be behind the screen. I also want this community piece that I hadn't been doing as much with.
Yeah, because you had kind of like pulled yourself, not like removed yourself, but you had pulled back a bit, just as a virtue of the fact that you were putting in so much work doing the research and the writing. I mean, you again, I'll say it again, you were basically like a mini biographer writing a biography like on some regular cadence.
Like
Whereas some people might say like I'm going to go to a farmhouse in Maine, right, for 6 months or a year, and I'm going to write a biography about somebody. You were basically doing that like weekly and monthly, and all of a sudden, then there's less of Justin like jumping around to every entrepreneurial event in LA, and less of Justin hosting these things, and and so it wasn't surprising at all to me when you not how it would manifest itself, and obviously we had talked, but like that you were heading in this direction, because part of it is the community guy was like suddenly just in his apartment all day, every day, even though we weren't locked down in the pandemic anymore.
Yeah, there's like I tell it as like almost like a pendulum that swung towards all media once I quit, because I had to, because it's just like I had this thing that's it's going well.
Yeah.
Let's double down on it. So really focusing on making it better. To then pendulum swung when I was like maybe like April, or I'd explored a lot of options at that point in time, just kind of figuring out like, do I do this full time? Do I do this on the side? Like, because it's hard to make it work financially, just from a pure like you have to get a lot of sponsors and grow the newsletter larger. So then it was like, okay, well, what do I do? And then I was like, I want to do events as a part of it. Let's just start hosting stuff. So I think it was April. I started hosting more events, and I've hosted a bunch of events in the past, different coffee meetups, casual things when I was at Vitalize. So this was like a similar thing of like, okay, let's do way more of these. Let's do hikes. Let's do coffee meetups. Let's play basketball. Let's do things that just like get founders, operators, investors together. So I started doing that. No plan, more a matter of like, let's just see what happens. Started doing it. It was interesting. I enjoyed it. The pendulum had definitely swung way more towards community than anything else. And then the newsletter was still going, but like it slowed down a little bit in terms of like, maybe I would redo some old editions or something in that time. And then it was maybe around May-ish, end of May, I announced kind of like, technically it's called Pillar. Originally I had to change the name, and then I changed it to Village Lane. But then it was like, okay, what's Village Lane going to be? It's more of a vetted community, just for founders. And then thought was very quickly after I launched, I had people apply from kind of all over the US, even some people internationally. And I was like, what do I want this to be though? Like, what is this thing? You need a certain density in one city to really have it going.
Right.
And so then shortly after that, the idea was, well, let's do a retreat earlier than I originally planned, to kind of build towards that, have a retreat, like have people, doesn't matter where they live, because they're just going to come in for this weekend for the retreat. So we did the retreat then in end of August. And so there was a lot of 2 months solid of prep to go into that, which I can go in details, but launched that. And then that was, end of August. So as of recording, it's late September here. And the last few weeks has kind of been almost like a debrief of what do we want to do? Like, is it, right. What is,
and then you just, as we were talking about off air for a little bit more context, then you just went to someone else's community event that has some similar kind of DNA to what you're envisioning, and then that fills you with both a bunch of like, oh, I would do this way, or oh, that's awesome, or oh, I would change that, and so that's a lot of the debrief kind of at the same time.
Yeah, and there's so many models, right? Like you can do anything. It's just like what is there out there that you feel like aligns with what you want to do, and I'm not doing any rocket science. Like this is all like lots of stuff has been done before. It's just in a different capacity, my own take, my own kind of vision of it. And so like right now I'm in that phase of like, okay, where am I taking this next? And like certain things I will eventually share is what I'm working on, but just to go way bigger and also get some help is going to be part of it, I think. And then figuring out like where this kind of evolves into, because there are two things to have. And so
Village Lane as it is today is vetted founder community, certain profile of entrepreneur founder, and is it mainly anchored in like is it national? Is it mainly anchored for now in Southern California where you're building up as you say, that density?
Yeah, so right now it's in LA as the kind of focus, and so it's all founders who are either doing 100K in revenue, like run rate, or they have a 250K raised, and so that starts in LA. So events will do, some people will be members, some people will be like prospective members. The core right now in the early days is just having events for these people to get together. So like in maybe a week ago, we had a beach day. And so
Yeah.
bringing together some people who are members, some people who are not members, just to have them then kind of get together, start talking about founder things and have a good time. This is like how I view things in the early days is you're just testing different things out. You're just kind of figuring out and exploring. And the context also is important. It's like I'm still writing deep dives and doing other stuff. So like this gets a piece of my time,
Right.
which is kind of goes into the bigger vision of where I want to take this. But yeah, all a vetted group of founders doing different in-person events is the focus. Is
That's awesome.
how I grow this. Yeah.
And you're doing something right in the world of building community and good relationships in Los Angeles when you've got Esprit Devora in all your events and endorsing you loudly and saying that you're doing it the right way. Like, cause she is like the spirit animal soul of doing community the right way. If we're talking about right way, wrong way. Right.
Yeah.
And so the fact that she is such a huge fan and believer in you and in what you're doing is just like the approval stamp, right?
Yeah. I think the core of that, if I had to break it down, I guess the core is really simple. I care. Like I care about helping people. I care about kind of
you legitimately do.
That's the only thing.
Yes, you love people and particularly entrepreneurs, like entrepreneurial people.
Those are my people. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
all right. So personal bent on all of this. Is there anything in this lexicon of experiments that you've run lately that you absolutely love that like brings you the most joy versus any of the other things?
There's so many. Like there's like two different types, right? There's the media content piece of it, which is infinite in terms of what you could create, what you could do, explore, whatever. And then there's the community piece of it, which again is like you have anything from a 40, 50 person coffee meetup, which I host every month, to probably the thing I've enjoyed, if I'm being honest, the most is like the basketball one. So we have like 15 guys get together, typical guys. Girls are invited, ladies are invited, but like they just haven't come yet. I don't know. We've had actually one or two, but like it's mostly been guys so far. But the basketball thing is the most fun because like more context. Like I played in high school like a long time ago, but I just love the competition and like it's just the most. You see a different side of people when they're playing basketball.
100%.
Like, it's so fun. That's been.
And from what I saw you post, like, and no one got injured, including you yet. So that's
both times. You have a bunch of 30-year-olds and no one gets injured. 30-plus-year-olds, no one gets injured. That's
a great sign. That's a great sign. Exactly. No. When you get to the point of like having like the Village Lane All-Star game, I'll be happy to come off the bench as the celebrity coach. Like I'll be happy to do that role because I don't want to be out there I don't think my body can stand running up and down the court anymore.
We could take it way bigger. I think the point you're asking before, you mentioned kind of what is it, where's the focus and everything. Obviously it's in Southern California for now, but even at the start of Village Lane, the intention was to go way bigger than that. I think it's going to be a series of things. I think you have to kind of start where you are, which is I'm in Los Angeles, so that makes sense. But the vision would definitely be way larger in terms of kind of doing events, both having a combination of larger like summits, I would describe them, or conferences, which I don't typically love conferences, but I can see where people who do it the right way, it becomes like a really interesting thing. And I've seen it done twice really well, 3 times really well. One was the Summit LA. I thought was really good. It's a little bit more elitist because the price point, but it was phenomenal. If I'm like looking back at that, the other one being obviously the one I kind of just went to with Highland. I think that one was also great. There's been a few others. It just depends on like the size, I guess. But I just think that like you can do it well if you have intentionality. So like the last one was like VC Platform. I have a VC Platform was a like summit in New York, and they like match people individually one-on-one. They had like in your name tag, they had 3 people you should meet. Like the details,
isn't that fun?
Even though it was large, were so good that I was like, okay, that's great. Most other conferences are just like overwhelming. Don't seem like you get the value from it. Those ones were like great. So the combination of events moving forward like that, like the big ones to like the medium to then super small, I think that's what the mix would be in different cities. That would be the goal.
No, I love that. And I mean, it validates the whole thesis behind the show, right? It's the value of entrepreneurial thinking, right? And so, yes, there are lots of ways that lots of people do lots of things, but the truth is, some people do the same things slightly better or different or with more attention to detail, more human-centered approach. And that's fundamentally you, right? That's the fancy way to describe. You're just a good guy from the Midwest who likes people, right? And your people happen to be entrepreneurs that you like more than other people, although you like all kinds of people, right? Yeah. And then when you create like a basketball event or a run thing or a coffee thing. It's just a different thing because it's you, because you're involved, right? Like that's key. And that's why even other people, like we mentioned Esprit, like someone like her can appreciate it, right? Because she's very intentional about what she does, right? Whereas maybe someone who's more opportunistic, as we talked about in the beginning, and kind of looking at it from the more like, how do I line my pockets approach, maybe they wouldn't appreciate your approach. Maybe they wouldn't see the value in your style or your type of event or curation. But the people that come and then come back, like they do, because it's connected to you. And I think, to your point, that's both the future of media, content, and community and events, right? Is this idea that and you and I used to talk about this kind of during the end of the pandemic, right? Is that like coming out of all this, like not a fad, but like just a general human trend, as remote work becomes more entrenched, which, as we all remind each other, remote work wasn't born during the pandemic. Like 19-20% of the working population, like white collar working population in the US, was already remote working before like 2019. And so the pandemic just accelerated it. But as these trends continue to evolve, and how we interact with each other socially and how we work with each other professionally shifts, there's a huge premium on connectedness, on human engagement. And that is, to me, going to be the space where people can win. It's fascinating. It's a joy to watch you do it, and it's fun because you and I are doing same things differently on the same paths, and we have some people in common that are helping encourage us along, and that's great because we're like kindred spirits in that sense. But also, you're doing some things that are very different than me, like and things that like I have no interest. Like I'm more at a place and stage in my life where I am more interested in like the media side and sitting alone and doing those things, and then interjecting myself into groups of people when I want to, because I spent most of the last 20 years constantly nurturing tens of thousands of groups of people, and I maybe got my introvert extrovert fill, right? And so now I'm very selective about stuff, right? If you would have your damn coffee meetings on any time other than Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m. when I have like a standing meeting for the last 3 years, I'd go to more of your coffee meetings because it's you and it's those groups, that the type of people that you attract. Right. But what you're doing with Village Lane is awesome. Like it's not what I would do because it's not what I want to do in my life, but what you're doing is awesome. And it does all fit that IP stack kind of that you talk about, which is just a really unique opportunity.
Yeah, and the thing with first off, we will definitely have then hey WeHo / Hollywood coffee meetup, easy fix, yes. Obviously on a different day. And the second thing with that, there's like a few different things. One being that if you think long term about it, I think it's a different approach, right? Just thinking long term, I'm happy to do a bunch of stuff for free. I'm happy to build it up because I think longer term, that's just getting people together, regardless of stage, is fine. The other piece of it that's kind of interesting to maybe mention is like I'm willing to test business models as well. So not just like deciding to do community or not. It's like when I mentioned the pendulum had swung all the way towards kind of content and then it kind of swung all the way towards community, it is actually swinging back towards like the middle more so of like, what does this mix look like between content and community? Because the things that scale, things like go way bigger, kind of reach more millions of people is obviously the media side of it. The thing that's kind of more intimate is the community piece of it. And I think that's one thing that's unique and kind of I'm looking at is not just the business model of like membership, which right now Village Lane is a membership, but I think it could eventually change to more of like a per event thing. That's one of the things I'm going to probably test out where it's like, okay, if it wasn't a membership, it was per event, certain events that were paid, most are free. Like, what would that look like? That's something that I'm open to. I'm open to kind of just like testing things. It kind of just depends on what the market wants. Cause it's tricky when you're dealing with like early stage founders who don't have a ton of capital. Like we don't want to constrain them or like put more pressure on them. So like, how do you finance these things? And a lot of it's sponsors. That's a big piece of it is like leveraging sponsors to be able to do that. So the model I think will also kind of evolve and change. And the other piece of that is then, okay, if you want to go bigger and like more impact, which is the driver for what I'm thinking of, is like then you get more help. So like me hiring someone to kind of run logistics and help community is something I'm very interested in at some point, relatively soon. Me leading the media without doing all the media is also, so like we'll see how this role evolves, but it'll shift from a kind of solo creator path to a more like small team, which I think is I'm more interested in right now.
Yeah. The fun thing too is, and you've said it a few different times, hopefully people will take this point of emphasis, right, is a lot of these business models are two things. One, all of these things in their individual silos are already proven. Like you said, we're not making up this stuff. Like this is how you do it. This is how you make money at it, right? It's like making a great stew. It's like your version of the dish versus some other chef's version of the dish, like, and how you mix it all together. And the interesting thing is, I think, listening to you on this last point, I feel like at some point in the not too distant future, what we call this company, like, so now you and I are deep, and since we've known each other in this space, like we're defaulting to like, it's a media company with these attachments, right? And I think that's just because there isn't like a preemptive descriptor that existed already, right? There was a predecessor to this. Sorry, is the word I was looking for, right? And so it's like, oh, it's a media company with this stuff. I think there's just a type of company like that is being created, not by you or by me individually, by hundreds of thousands of people like us that are doing these same types of things in these different niches, different spaces. And at some point, 5-10 years, like we'll be like, and I'll just throw it out, like a community company or whatever it might be called. I don't know that that's it, right? But like something like there's going to be this like new version of corporate entity that has these pieces of the puzzle and serve communities or audiences or both, right, in complementary ways. And it just hasn't been defined yet. And so right now we're all calling it like a media company with a human touch, but maybe it's not that at all.
Yeah. Well, the thing too with it is like, as community, as you mentioned, continues to grow, and as also the media side of it, people keep becoming, you could call creators, you could call entrepreneurs who create whatever. There's this opportunities for people to have businesses. And then also our mutual friend, Will, always want to give him a shout out from Cheese House Capital. When you have different funding options for how these businesses go from like a solo creator to someone who like has these options to either like you're going to do like create books and do other things with it. Well, then a lot more people could be independent on their own, doing something that's funded that can make them a living. And it's very interesting to me. I think when I think about that piece more and more recently, it's like thinking of what Will's doing, thinking of like Slow Ventures who invested into a YouTuber, like $1 million or something. That's super interesting. There's just like, there's so much with that when you combine these two, and then what does the business model look like? What is it called? But also, is it bootstrapped or is it funded? So that's a whole other discussion, because I've obviously been in this venture world for so long, but then seeing different options pop up is also fascinating, because I'm just like, well, a lot of people could use that. Like they just need a little capital to grow their news. Like, that just like it's super interesting.
No, it's fascinating. There's all these things. It's almost like we made like a mad rush to the door on let's find 1 million ways to monetize 1 million different things, commercialize 1 million different things. And now, as you said, now like the rest of those economies, those micro and macro economies are catching up to the fact that now people are out there trying to do this. And just like, hey, let's figure out 1 million ways to make froyo. Let's figure out 1 million different ways to have hamburger stands. Like so people like rush to the front, and now the support systems, the capital systems, all that will kind of follow along, and you'll create entire new economies inside of our broader economy, which is fascinating, right? That's the way it should work. Okay, last question before we get to our closing segment. This is just curiosity, right? Because you've sat, for a young guy, I say you're an old soul, right? You've sat already early in your career, you've sat on so many different sides of this kind of, I'll use my kitchen table, which is round as an example, right? The venture side, the founder interviewer chair, the founder biographer chair, the entrepreneur yourself now building a business, supporting other founders chair. Give us a little insight on what you think kind of the state of the entrepreneurial economy is today, like the big flaws or weaknesses, or the big positives that you see unfolding right now. And then if you want to, maybe kind of what's your hope for how Village Lane will positively impact that?
Those questions are always hard because you have such a narrow view on things. So even me studying, like a lot of the things that people have studied, it's the past, right? It's what have things been built before. What I like about it is more of a broad generalization, is that people are trying to go independent, build their own things, work on side projects. You see with AI that lead into that, people testing things out. I love seeing more people podcasting, more people doing newsletters, more people trying to build companies in general, just as I think more people should be building things. I don't know where that kind of comes from, but for me, just being able to see that in the industry is interesting. But then I also see, like, from the venture side, like, a lot of people should not be building venture-backed businesses or trying to build businesses that are not venture-backable. It's just a game that, I don't know, everyone decided they wanted to play that game in particular, which is for a very small subset of people.
Right. The subset is like 2.5-3% of the economy. And yet it seemed like for a handful of like 10 years, like everybody was mad rushing that door trying to get in.
Yeah, and I think it should be like it's obviously open, like in theory, to everyone, but it's less in practice, just based on having a network to be able to get to that venture capital, anyways. But I think I like seeing that people are building things and trying to kind of create things. I think that's a plus overall. I think
Yeah.
with the tools we have today, my newsletter is built on Beehive. Like Beehive is phenomenal as an email tool, but there's other tools you can use for that. Podcasting, we're using Riverside right now. There's other platforms like just to see these tools and obviously the whole thing of AI, like to see these tools to be able to create stuff. I've seen friends of mine, start to play around and build stuff with AI. Is like, that's interesting. That would never be an option before. To me, that's fascinating because for me, like looking at my parents, they didn't have any of these things. They couldn't like just build this like media empire on
None.
the side. Like there's nothing. Like it was
Zero.
like, get a job or like start a,
Literally, yes.
yeah.
Get a job and then hopefully hold that single job for your entire life until you retire or die.
Yeah, which is a whole different game. So that's where I kind of like see the industry. It's like I like that there's things being built. People are trying to build more things. I think there's definitely a kind of undertone of entitlement for too many founders where they're kind of like assume venture capital just because they're building it, they want to raise it, they should, or they
Right.
can, which to me is always odd. But also I want to see more like people going after small businesses, people trying to build different industries, people trying to take on different problems like climate tech. That's interesting. Like people trying to take on other things as
Yeah.
well is also something I think we should kind of address and like go after. So we'll see how it
I love
evolves.
that.
But I also take a very narrow like view in
Yeah, no, no,
general.
no. Of course. Again, I mean, it's my curiosity is your perspective. I'm asking your opinions, right? So, and part of it, I could have even asked the question in a different way because you play basketball with 15 founders, you have coffee with, you hike with 40 founders, like an entrepreneur and
Yeah.
investors. So you're hearing, even though you're rightly saying those questions tend to lead us to like analyze the past, literally, even if it's the recent past. But the benefit of you is the way you're living is you're living surrounded by the present. Like you're engaging socially with people that are building today and
Yeah.
that just came to it maybe as a first time or second time entrepreneur. And so those opinions and their perspectives probably seep their way into how you see the current landscape, which is awesome. It's good to know, and it's encouraging
Yeah.
too. Like I love that delineation between the venture backable and kind of the rest of the world, because I think that's, as you said, too much of the landscape got tilted towards that for too long for too many people, and for most of those, if not all of those people, it was inappropriate. And so then that creates a whole subsector of like I've said to some entrepreneurs recently, like some really really disappointed, disenchanted kind of entrepreneurs, which then oftentimes, sadly, and we just talked about this on an episode the other day, like then they'll reflect upon that. Mickey Reynolds and I were talking about this. They'll take that negativity or that rejection, they'll reflect upon that and say like, I'm the failure, right? As opposed to no, the project was just not a good fit for the kid. It was a bad fit to date that venture firm, right? But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean you're a bad person or even that you're not a smart person, right? And there was a lot of that going on in the last 4 or 5 year bubble.
Yeah, and especially if you haven't been on the other side of the table, you also don't have the full context. So like if you've
Yeah,
never been at a VC firm, like, I just always bring this up. I remember like talking to Gail, who's the founder of Vitalize, where I was at, and it was like you see the 50 to 100 pitches per day in her inbox, and you're
it's
just like,
insane.
people wonder why they take time to get back to them or like they don't respond at all. It's like it's literally you cannot deal with hundreds and hundreds of pitches. I know it's their job, but they're trying to also prioritize. So it's like
Right.
you can't just see everything. And founders who get disappointed by that, it's like if you're going to play this game, understand the rules of the game, how the game
Yeah.
works, who the players are in the game, and then the odds of the game. And
Yeah.
I
No,
don't
very
think a
much
lot of
so.
founders do that.
No, of course not. No, because and also because there's not enough people out there. So thank you for saying that, because there's not enough people out there who say what you just said, right? Because there's a whole because the mouthpiece has historically been the industry, and the industry's job is to fill up the top of their funnel with those 100 pitches every day, right? And so then everybody
Yeah.
hears that, oh, I'm supposed to do that because that's going to get me access, and you just called honest bullshit on that. Like, hey, whoa, time out. Like, let's again remember, like, different players have different motivations in this game. The rules are what they are, et cetera, et cetera. So that's awesome. That's a great shout out.
Yeah.
All right, last question. I love in the last segment just to make a little bit more of a takeaway. We've given a bunch of takeaways today already for both founders and investors to think about how to use media, how to use community, how you and I believe we see kind of the future evolving of all this space. But let's bring it back. Let's talk about community at the end here. Maybe 2 or 3 practical steps that early stage founders, the folks that are surrounded you and your Village Lane community now, that they can take to build intentionally, to build strong, supportive community around their businesses. 2 or 3
Yeah.
practical steps.
But this, I mean, the first starting point is like, what resources are you actually going to devote to this? Because if you don't have people or money behind it, like you have to be reasonable with, or I guess set your expectations to what you're actually going to put behind it. If someone's going to do the Brex strategy of dinners, they're spending a lot of money on dinners and getting involved with partners who can host dinners across the country. That is a very intentional strategy they have taken to then build relationships from that. They know that they can build relationships with VCs who will tell their portfolio companies. Like that's an example of like you're going pretty all in on that piece of it. But if you want to dabble in it, like you could easily host a dinner with your potential customers or people in your ecosystem or people who are in your industry that you can then kind of get perceived as an expert or the one on the top because you're leading it, because you're hosting it. So I think the first thing is like the resources on what you're willing to devote to it. The second thing is just to dabble. I think you can start very easily with, it could be a park hang. If your brand is like more premium, cool, rent a nice dinner space and have a private dinner with 8 people that are in your industry or 8 customers or 8 potential customers. And if you want to really go bigger, then it's a matter of, okay, do you want to host the events yourself or do you want to co-host and then be able to like sponsor in that game, which is a different side of it. Because then if you want to do that, that's also an opportunity where you can get involved. Like, good example is Tech Weeks are coming up for SF and LA, depending on when this released. It may be already happened, but like I'm co-hosting with Avenue Z, and Avenue Z is a PR firm. I've known them for a long time because like they acquired Bevel, which is also a company like I knew, but they're co-hosting. They're bringing some capital to help do it. I'm leveraging my audience to help get people there. Perfect example of like doing events in a different way. So any company could think of it from that perspective. Like, do you want to partner with people who have the audience that you need? If you don't want to fully handle it yourself, if you're going to handle it yourself, do you want to actually hire a person to run that for you? And what's the frequency and what's your expectations for it? Because you can't expect an instant ROI on this either. If you're coming with a short-term approach ROI, like we're not running Facebook ads for e-commerce. This is a different game. Like relationships is not that simple. So then it's a matter of like having a long-term view of this to be able to play that out.
That's awesome.
I would say.
I love it. Thank you for that. And my takeaway from that and from the whole episode is experiment.
Always.
Just be an experimentalist. Try things. Put yourself out there. Frame it if you have to in your mind, as you did, Justin, at the very beginning of the show, in the context of like, what's the worst that could happen, right? And then extrapolate from there. And you're in a good spot, buddy. This is a blast. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing with us your thoughts on community and your perspective. As I try to quietly, slowly redefine the use of the term entrepreneurs and entrepreneurialism and innovators and all that into entrepreneurial thinkers, you've always been one of the most entrepreneurial thinking people. And I kind of have never really cared about what your role has been. Or your day job, so to speak, at various points along the way, because the thing that has been most intriguing to me from day one in our friendship has been that you apply this kind of experimental, creative, self-confident, entrepreneurial thinking across all the different things that you do. And the world needs more of Justin Gordon. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. No, I appreciate it.
How can people connect, find you, follow you, or find Village Lane, sign up, etc.? How do we do that?
Yeah, I feel like everything flows from the newsletter. So justgogrind.com. That's obviously the core of everything. Anything updates for Village Lane actually flows through that. Anything I'm doing flows through that. So I'll make it very simple and just say justgogrind.com. You can find everything from there. Yeah.
Go subscribe, like, follow, be a part of it, get in that community. And who knows, maybe we'll see you in WeHo on a coffee meetup on a Wednesday morning at some point in the near future.
It'll be at your apartment right next door. Thanks.
Thanks, buddy.
Have a good one.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did recording it. As always, we thank you so much for listening and watching. Today's show was recorded here in Los Angeles and produced by the incomparable Deanna Bernal in Mexico City. You know, we can only grow this show by you listening and sharing the show with friends. So please find, like, follow, subscribe, and share our audio-only show on Spotify, Apple, or via any other popular podcasting platforms, as well as find the video version of our show now available on our YouTube channel over at Entrepreneurial Thinkers. And of course, you can follow along on our various social media platforms for fun and informative clips and content at Entrepreneurial Thinkers, wherever you can find us. And if you'd like to connect with me, you can find me at I Am Rob Ryan on just about any social media platform. Gracias, thank you, and have an awesome day.